Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And today we're going to be looking at another exciting, well, I shouldn't say exciting, I should say concerning topic, and that is Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Trinidad, and Guyana. Have we sold out to the US? And we're going to be looking at the status of forces agreement because that is something that we need to delve into. One of the things that I find very interesting about the region right now is that we don't learn our lessons and we don't have enough of geopolitics in the region in terms of commentary. We don't have any geopolitical channel in the Caribbean. We have what we call, drama domestic podcasts, which give us the dramas happening in the region, in each country. And that is what it gives us something to chew on. But that is not going to free us. It's not going to liberate us. So we're going to be looking at this very concerning topic, Jamaica security, economic dependence, and the American connection. I remember when, the United States was after Venezuela last year, and I did say that when we're talking about Trinidad last year, in the fact that, Trinidad helped the United States with the capture of Nicolas Maduro. Many people were suggesting that, oh, why are you talking about Trinidadian business? And I'm saying that this is the business of the Caribbean. All of us, it has implications for all of us. And many of us have still not yet learned that lesson. We think everything that happens in the Caribbean is just, okay, it's Barbados, let them deal with it. Or it's Jamaica, let them deal with it. Or it's Trinidad, let them deal with it. Not understanding that our world is interconnected and everything that affects Trinidad or Guyana or anywhere else will affect all of us. Will affect all of us, including citizens in the United States of America. Okay, so let's begin with our discussion. Jamaica has maintained a close relationship with the United States for decades. The relationship involves trade, tourism, investment, security, cooperation, migration, and a large Jamaican diaspora in the United States. But dependence creates leverage. When a country's economy depends heavily on tourism, remittances, foreign investment, and access to American markets, decisions made in Washington can have consequences in Kingston and throughout the Caribbean. The question is not whether Jamaica should have relations with the United States. Of course it should. The question is, does Jamaica have enough economic and diplomatic diversification to say no when its interests differ from those of Washington? That is the real test of sovereignty. Now, the Dominican Republic has economic integration become strategic dependence. The Dominican Republic presents an interesting case. Its economy is deeply connected to the United States through trade, tourism, investment, remittances, and the movement of people. The DR is also strategically important because of its geographical position in the Caribbean. But economic integration can produce two very different outcomes. It can provide opportunities for development, or it can create dependency. The Dominican Republic has benefited enormously from its relationship with the United States. But the question we should ask is whether that relationship gives the DR greater economic independence or makes the country increasingly tied to the American priorities. Now let's look at Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago, we're going to look at the whole matter of the connection with the United States. Trinidad and Tobago is different. This is an energy producing country with natural gas and an important petrochemical sector. Energy gives a country strategic value, and strategic value can translate into bargaining power. But Trinidad and Tobago also operates within a global energy market, corporations, and major geopolitical powers. So the question becomes, who ultimately benefits from the region's natural resources, and how much control do Caribbean governments actually exercise over their strategic assets? Now, this is bigger than America. It is about whether Caribbean countries possess the institutional strength, capital, and political interdependence necessary to negotiate with powerful foreign governments and corporations on equal terms. Now, let's look at Guyana, because these are the countries we're looking at in terms of they're signing these status of agreements with the United States, what we call SOFA. Now, Guyana, the most important case here is that when we look at Guyana, Guyana may be the most fascinating case of all. The discovery of enormous offshore oil reserves has transformed the country's geopolitical importance. So it's very important in the geopolitical realm. Guyana is no longer simply a small South American state. It has become an energy powerhouse with increasing attention from the United States and other major powers. And that creates both opportunity and danger. Oil can finance development, but oil can also attract geopolitical competition. The question Guyana must confront is, can it use its newfound wealth to strengthen national sovereignty, or will its strategic importance make it increasingly dependent upon powerful foreign partners? And we should remember something important. This is not simply about the United States. China, Europe, India, and other powers also have interests in Guyana and the wider Caribbean. The objective should be, therefore, not to replace American dependence with Chinese dependence or anybody else's dependence, right? The objective should be strategic autonomy, which we lack here in the Caribbean region. Have we been sold out? Or have we become realistic? This is a question that we need to ask ourselves. This is where I want to challenge the language of title, have we been sold out? That implies betrayal, but perhaps the reality is more complicated. Small countries operate in a world where economic power matters. They need investment, they need markets, they need security, they need technology, they need access to capital. And they cannot simply pretend that geopolitical power does not exist. The problem is when partnership becomes dependency, and dependency becomes political leverage. And political leverage begins to influence the decisions made here in the Caribbean region. Now, we are facing a problem, right? And perhaps the greatest problem is not that America is powerful. The problem is that we are fragmented. And we're also facing a problem of ignorance, ubiquitous ignorance in the Caribbean region. We don't understand how politics work, right? We think it's all about, the JLP versus the PNP and the PNM versus the UNC. That is how limited our political analysis is here in the region. As a result of that, we are going to be defeated. Jamaica negotiates by itself, Trinidad and Tobago negotiates by itself, Guyana negotiates by itself because we're domestic and we are limited. The Dominican Republic negotiates by itself, and eventually these countries have limited bargaining power. But what if the Caribbean negotiated collectively? What if CARICOM developed stronger common positions on energy, trade, technology, security, and foreign investment? What if Caribbean countries diversified their economic relationships rather than becoming dependent on any single power? That would give the region something far more valuable than choosing between Washington and Beijing. That's the choice that we have been presented. Sovereignty has a price. So have Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana sold out to the United States? Well, I think they have. The United States is not the only foreign power seeking influence in our region, but it is the dominant one. And Caribbean governments are not necessarily powerless victims. Well, they pretend as if they are. And to some extent, I think we have gone so far that I think that they are powerless. They don't have agency. They pretend to make choices, they pretend to negotiate, but behind the scenes, they are capitulating to Washington's diktats. Now, they pursue their national interest, or they attempt to pursue national interest, but sovereignty means more than having a flag, which we think that is what matters, a constitution and a seat at the United Nations. At least who controls the United Nations, we should ask ourselves. True sovereignty requires the capacity to make independent decisions. That is what we need to understand. So what we live in essentially is a region that has slaves, and that we do not have the agency, or we do not possess the capacity to challenge Washington and any of these global powers. And economic independence is an important part of that capacity which we lack. So perhaps the question we should really be asking is not, have we sold out to America? Perhaps it is, have we built Caribbean economies strong enough that we can cooperate with America without becoming dependent upon America? And which we find ourselves that we are. And how are we going to plunge ourselves out of that dependency? That is what we have to ask ourselves. Because a friend is one thing, a partner is another, but when you cannot afford to say no to your partner, you may no longer be negotiating, you may be depending, and that is the conversation that we are going to have in this afternoon's conversation. Now, we're going to look at the whole matter that there's a status of forces agreement that Jamaica has just signed, and it's what Trinidad and Tobago signed, and many other Caribbean countries signed. I understand that the United States has status of agreements with over 120 countries in the world. So this is nothing new, right? And this is not only about Jamaica or the Caribbean, it's about the world and the fact that the United States is controlling the entire world, right? The entire world is coming under the leadership, the dictatorship of the United States of America. So let's listen to what she's saying here.
Between the two countries. The agreement establishes the terms under which members of the U.S. Armed Forces may be temporarily present in Jamaica for mutually agreed activities, including training exercises and joint operations. The signing follows talks between U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and Jamaica's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of National Security Dr. Horace Chang on the margins of the America's Counter-Cartels Coalition Forum in Panama on August 12. According to a statement from the National Security Ministry, Jamaica now joins more than 120 countries with similar agreements with the United States. The two countries have a long history of security cooperation, including joint military training, professional exchanges, and humanitarian and disaster response activities. The new agreement is expected to provide a more modern and predictable framework that cooperation with increased focus on regional security, disaster response, and efforts to combat organized criminal networks involved in the trafficking of drugs, guns, and people. The statement further states that SOFA signals a commitment by the Jamaica Defense Force and the U.S. Armed Forces to deepen their partnership in confronting transnational criminal organizations in the region.
So what we're seeing here is that they're telling us that this is military agreement, right? The status of agreement, forces agreement. What we need to remember is that when Trinidad and Tobago signed that new status of forces agreement last year, before Nicolas Maduro was captured, they were talking about, controlling the territory and the United States having the right to send its military to Trinidad at any given moment whenever it deems necessary. And that is not good. We saw also where soldiers, not soldiers, but fishermen and other Caribbean citizens on high sea were actually murdered, killed, right, on high seas, and that we have not been able to confirm whether or not these people were criminals. But the United States is suggesting that it is signing up these agreements because it wants to control drug trafficking and gun running in the Caribbean. But is that true? We know that that is not true. We know who controls the drug trafficking trade. We know who controls the gun trafficking and the drug trafficking. The United States does. So what is this status of agreement? We must look at what it is, and I'm going to educate you this afternoon about what this really is. Now, let me just open up before I begin with the status of forces agreement. There are lots of us in the Caribbean. We have now adopted the United States way of, inspecting or critiquing the world, right? Everything has to do with black and white. But the world is more complex and more diverse than black-white issues. In fact, I've told you scientifically, black-white do not exist. We are the ones who've created that, and we are going to be killed by just being ignorant about this black-white nonsense. Now, Pan-Africanism can become so abstract that it stops functioning as an analytical tool. If every Caribbean problem is reduced to colonialism, race, exploitation, and Western domination, important differences between countries, institutions, economies, and geopolitical circumstances can disappear, and we get very less nuanced. We cannot critique anything intelligently anymore because it's under the realm of this black and white, and this is the East versus the West sort of analysis, which is rather very simplistic. Now, my concern is not with Pan-Africanism itself. My concern is with the tendency to use Pan-Africanist ideologies rather as a substitute for analysis. We have to be more practical and more coherent in our analysis in the region here. Now, we cannot understand the contemporary Caribbean simply by placing everything inside a black versus white framework or paradigm. The Caribbean is extraordinarily diverse, racially, ethnically, culturally, economically, and politically. Guyana is not Jamaica. Trinidad and Tobago is not Haiti. The Dominican Republic is not Barbados, and Africa itself is not a single political or economic entity. We must understand that. And many times I'm seeing the critique as very simplistic. We must understand that not even Africa, on the African continent, do they see themselves as holistically the same peoples. We need to understand that. If our young intellectuals approach every problem through the same ideological lens, we risk explaining everything while understanding very little. And in the Caribbean region here, we understand very little. We are limiting ourselves to this black versus white construct and paradigm. The region needs thinkers who can move beyond historical grievance and examine institutions, economics, and the economies, demographics, technology, energy, geopolitics, governance, and human behavior. Ideology can tell us what we believe. Analysis must tell us what is actually happening. That's the difference. Ideology, most of the times when people come on chats and podcasts, they come to hear their ideology. They're not here to analyze what is actually happening on the geopolitical scene. And we must do that. And that distinction matters enormously if we are going to confront the complex challenges facing the Caribbean. Now, what is SOFA? That's the Status of Forces Agreement. That's what they call it. A Status of Forces Agreement is an international agreement that establishes the legal status of foreign military personnel stationed in another country. It normally addresses questions such as who has jurisdiction when a foreign soldier commits a crime? Which country has the right to prosecute? How are arrests and investigations handled? Who can enter and search military facilities? What taxes and customs rules apply? What happens when military personnel cause injury or property damage? What rights and obligations apply to dependents and civilian contractors? And what rights do the citizens of that country really have? SOFA, which is a Status of Forces Agreement, therefore does something much more consequential than simply regulating soldiers. It creates a special legal framework governing the relationship between a foreign military presence and the sovereignty of the host state. And that is why we're seeing where the United States can go into the region and they can use drones to actually bomb and to shoot and to strike boats in the region, and they are not held accountable, which means therefore that they can shoot you and me, right? And they don't and will not be held accountable in our legal framework, in our legal jurisprudence. And that is where the civil liberties question begins. One, now we have to look at the modern SOFA. The modern SOFA emerged from the expansion of permanent overseas military deployments, particularly after the Second World War. The United States emerged from World War II with a global network of military installations. During the Cold War, the American military presence expanded throughout Europe, Asia, and other strategic regions. The NATO SOFA of 1951 became one of the most important models. It established rules governing the status of NATO forces stationed in other member countries. The underlying principle was practical. If foreign troops are going to be stationed permanently in another country, there must be rules determining which legal system governs them. But there is an inherent tension here. A host country says, these are our laws and our citizens. The sending country says, these are our military personnel operating under our command. So if they rape and they create mayhem, they will not be held accountable in your country, because according to what they're saying, these are our military personnel operating under our command, which means that they will be totally freed of any sort of accusations. The SOFA attempts to reconcile those competing claims. Now, the Caribbean has a long history of foreign military intervention and foreign bases. The United States occupied or intervened in several Caribbean countries during the 20th century, including Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. The history is important because military agreements rarely emerge in a political vacuum. They emerge from relationships involving security, economic dependence, geopolitics, military power. And we do not have a keen understanding of geopolitics in this region at all. During the Cold War, Washington regarded the Caribbean as strategically important because of its proximity to the United States and the Panama Canal. The Cuban Revolution intensified that strategic concern. American military and security relationships consequently became deeply embedded in the region. Now, let us look at Cuba and Guantanamo Bay. Perhaps the most extraordinary Caribbean example is Guantanamo Bay. The United States obtained control of Guantanamo Bay, or naval base, through agreements with Cuba following the Spanish-American War. The 1903 lease arrangements gave the United States extensive rights over the territory, and that was a very sad sort of agreement between the United States and Cuba. After the Cuban Revolution, the political relationships between Washington and Havana collapsed, but the United States retained the base. Guantanamo, therefore, illustrates something fundamental about military agreements. A military agreement can survive long after the political circumstances that created it have disappeared. I repeat that. A military agreement can survive long after the political circumstances that created it have disappeared. So it means, therefore, that let us say that the United States signed that SOFA with Trinidad and Tobago before they captured Nicolas Maduro. It can still, even though that Nicolas Maduro has been captured and is now in the United States, the US still can use the principles, right, and all of the agreements mentioned in that SOFA to carry out any other invasion that they deem necessary. Very important that you understand this very important point. It also demonstrates how questions of sovereignty can remain contested for generations. Now, let's look at the Dominican Republic, which is also a very important country in the region. The Dominican Republic provides another important case because of repeated American military involvement. The United States occupied the DR from 1916 to 1924. American forces returned in 1965 during the Dominican Civil War. Do you know that the Dominican Republic had a civil war in 1965? The 1965 intervention is particularly important because Washington presented the intervention partly through the language of preventing communist expansion. So the United States always provides some sort of pretext, whether it's drug running, it's gun trafficking, they always give you some sort of pretext, excuse, if you will, for them to invade you, but neither is true. Again, the larger lesson is that Caribbean sovereignty has historically existed alongside powerful external security interests. Today, the relationship is much more institutionalized and diplomatic, but the historical memory remains important. Now, I want to shift your attention to Okinawa, and that is a prefecture right there in Japan. And I became aware of this prefecture when I read the book on imperialism. One of them, that's what's his name again? Chalmers Johnson's book, right, which is very educational for those of you who want to understand the status of forces agreement. Please go and get his trilogy on the American Empire. And this brings us to Okinawa. If you want to understand the potential consequences of a foreign military presence for a civilian population, Okinawa is indispensable. And I would recommend that you go and you read Okinawa and the SOFA and you see what hell they've been through with these SOFA's agreement. Now, after World War II, the United States administered Okinawa for decades. So that's what happened. Okinawa was returned to Japanese sovereignty in 1972, but the American military presence remained. So they can remain. Today, Okinawa contains a disproportionately large share of the US military presence in Japan relative to its geographical size. The legal framework is principally that in 1960 US-Japan SOFA contained in the Status of Forces Agreement under the US-Japan Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security. And this is where Chalmers Johnson becomes particularly relevant. Very important gentleman, well, he's now deceased. Chalmers Johnson, particularly in Blowback, that's one of the texts on American imperialism, The Sorrows of Empire, that's what the book I was trying to remember, and his writings on American military bases argued that America's overseas military presence creates consequences that Americans frequently fail to see and they don't understand. He examined what he called the empire of bases. His argument was not simply that America had too many military installations. It was that permanent bases can produce political resentment, environmental damage, economic distortions, conflicts over land, crimes involving military personnel, and tensions over jurisdiction. And go and read his books, and you see what American soldiers have done to Japanese women. The rape, okay, the accidents, okay, it is just something that will blow your mind. Okinawa became one of his most important examples. Johnson's broader argument was that Americans tend to see these bases from Washington's perspective, security for America. And we in the Caribbean think that the United States is here to secure us, but they're not. You can always think the opposite. When the US says something, think in the opposite manner. If they say security, you're going to say crime or insecurity. But the people living around the bases experience something different. The consequences of someone else's security policy, that distinction is enormously important. Now, let's look at the civil liberties concern or question. This brings us directly to our argument. SOFA does not automatically violate civil liberties. That would be too broad. The problem arises when the legal arrangements surrounding foreign forces create circumstances in which local citizens have less practical access to justice or governmental protection than they would ordinarily have under domestic law. And I would say, for example, let us say that a lady should be raped, all right, or the people who were killed on the high seas, they were actually slaughtered. Washington can get away, and there won't be any justice that is given to the people, to the victims. Now, consider a hypothetical case. A foreign serviceman is accused of assaulting a local resident. The questions immediately become, who arrests him? Who investigates? Who gets custody? Who prosecutes? And where does the trial occur? Which legal system applies? These are not merely military questions. They are questions of civilian rights and sovereignty. And Okinawa has repeatedly experienced controversy surrounding crimes and accidents involving U.S. military personnel. Now, there's another civil liberties issue that is sometimes overlooked: the right of communities to control their own environment. Military bases consume enormous amounts of land, and that could be some of the reasons why we're being taken off our land. They generate aircraft noise, they create environmental risks, they can restrict development, they can impose safety burdens on surrounding communities. In Okinawa, opposition to the relocation of Marine Corps' air station, that is Futenma, and the controversy over the Enoka relocation project demonstrate how deeply the issue penetrates Japanese domestic politics. The central question becomes, who gets to decide what risks a community must accept for the security of an entire alliance? This is a democratic question. The Caribbean should ask the same question, or the questions that we are posing here. And this is where I think the discussion becomes particularly relevant to the Caribbean. Whenever a Caribbean government enters into a military or security agreement with a major external power, we should not simply ask, will this make us safer? Or should we ask, what legal privileges are being granted? What jurisdiction is being surrendered or modified? What happens if a foreign military member commits an offense? Who has custody? Who investigates? What happens to civilians injured by military activities? Who pays for environmental damage? And how long does the agreement last? Can the host country terminate it? And can Parliament and the public actually scrutinize its provisions? These questions should be asked before the crisis occurs. Now, there is an uncomfortable reality here. Small countries often need security partnerships. The Caribbean faces drug trafficking, human trafficking, maritime crime, disaster emergencies, illegal fishing, transnational organized crime. Cooperation with the United States can therefore provide some sort of benefits, right? But cooperation and sovereignty are not mutually exclusive. The danger occurs when a security relationship becomes so asymmetrical that the smaller country becomes unable to negotiate as an equal. And that is the lesson I would draw from Okinawa. The question isn't simply, are American troops good or bad? As we like to put things, black or white, and it's not just, you can't frame that from that perspective. You've got to think broader. That's too simplistic. The real question is, what happens to democratic accountability when a foreign military presence becomes structurally embedded within a civilian society? The Caribbean must learn from Okinawa. This is where I would make the argument particularly forceful here, and I'm trying to make you understand that Okinawa is a territory that we should be able to examine, because we're going to see elements of what is happening in Okinawa. These things are going to be unfolded here in the Caribbean region. The Caribbean should not wait until there is a scandal, a criminal case, an environmental disaster, or a confrontation between civilians and foreign military personnel. The legal framework must be examined beforehand. The SOFAs should be transparent, and they're not transparent. They're all obscure. Their jurisdictional provisions should be understood by the public. Parliaments should scrutinize them. Civilian protections should be explicit. Environmental responsibilities should be clear, and the host country must retain meaningful sovereign authority. Because sovereignty is not simply the ability to raise a flag, which many of us think it is. Sovereignty is the ability to enforce your laws. If you can't, you're not sovereign. And if there are circumstances in which a foreign military member can operate beyond the ordinary reach of the host country's justice system, then we have to ask a very serious question. How much sovereignty has actually been retained? That is the conversation the Caribbean needs to have. And Okinawa provides one of the world's clearest warnings about what can happen when the security needs of a great power become permanently embedded in the daily lives of a smaller community. Now, the issue is not whether Caribbean governments should cooperate with the United States. The issue is whether cooperation gradually becomes dependency, and whether dependency gives a great power influence over the sovereign decisions of smaller states. A military agreement may appear narrow: access to a port, permission to conduct exercises, logistical support, or jurisdiction over visiting personnel. But accumulated over decades, these arrangements can create a strategic architecture in which a powerful country acquires extraordinary access to the territory, infrastructure, and institutions of smaller nations. That is the question we should be asking about the Caribbean. Who controls the ports? Who has access to our territorial waters? And right now we don't have water in the Caribbean. We're facing drought, severe drought as it were. Who conducts military exercises? Who has access to intelligence? What jurisdiction applies to foreign personnel? What agreements have been signed that the public rarely discusses? And most importantly, can a small country say no when its interests conflict with those of a superpower? This is not anti-Americanism right now. These are critical questions that we need to ask ourselves. Very important that we begin to ask these very important questions. Now, Peter Espute in a Gleaner article mentioned something about it, which I find his thoughts to be rather interesting and something that needs to be put to the audience, the public. He's asking, Peter, one-sided treaties and reciprocity. So they're always one-sided, these agreements that Caribbean countries enter with the United States. And so 2 weeks, he's suggesting here, Jamaica's Minister of National Security and Peace, Dr. Horace Chang, signed a Status of Forces Agreement, that is SOFA, with United States Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, at the Second America's Counter Cartel Coalition, and that was held in Panama. Now, we have here that since what we call independence, and he has independence here in quotation marks, because we're not independent, we are slaves here in the region, members of the U.S. Armed Forces and the Jamaica Defense Force have participated in joint training exercises, professional exchanges, humanitarian and disaster response activities, and other forms of security cooperation without any such agreement. Now, he's suggesting that we didn't have to enter into a Status of Forces agreement, but we have. The Caribbean, Jamaica, and many other countries have. In fact, as I said to you before, the United States had an agreement, SOFA agreement, with over 120 countries around the world. But the Trump administration now believes that a special treaty is necessary to formalize the terms under which members of one country's armed forces may be temporarily present in another country. The agreement is a reciprocal one. If Jamaica wants to land armed JDF forces on U.S. soil, this SOFA provides the framework within which permission may be sought. And if the U.S. wishes to land U.S. Marines on Goat Island or wherever, they can use the SOFA to make it happen. Prior to the SOFA, that sort of arrangement was not uncommon. At various times, I have seen British troops, Canadian troops, and U.S. troops wandering around the Jamaican countryside. The SOFA, I imagine, just makes it easier and quicker to deploy U.S. military detachments. I do not think that Jamaica has any plans for the JDF to land on Miami Beach or Key West or Biscayne Beach. The initiative to sign the SOFA came from the United States. They must know what they intend to do. But we do not know what the new arrangements are for the deployment. So far, the SOFA is top secret. So what it is top secret. Nobody really knows what is going on. But we have seen what happened in Trinidad. We have seen what happened to Venezuela, okay? And we have seen what is happening to Cuba and other countries. So we understand that while some of the agreements might be done secretively, but we must be careful observers. We ought to be careful observers that we have seen what has taken place in other countries. So don't behave as if we're naive and stupid, which we sometimes are. But the negotiations for the SOFA took place on the sidelines of the Second America's Counter Cartel Coalition Forum in Panama. And on the website of the U.S. Department of Defense appears the following in relation to the Jamaica Agreement. Look at what they're saying, I quote, "This SOFA agreement is a message to the criminal organizations in the region, not in Jamaica, but in the region, that the United States Armed Forces and JDF are committed to deepening and expanding their cooperation, including in their efforts to fight criminal organizations and narco-terrorists who traffic guns, drugs, and people. We," unquote. Now, we have seen this before. That's the same sort of language that they used when they were actually reestablishing the SOFA with Trinidad and Tobago. The SOFA draws Jamaica into the U.S. war against narco-terrorism, and we know what that war looks like. Last Tuesday, the U.S. military blasted out of the water a boat in the Caribbean Sea suspected of being used to transport illegal drugs, killing 4 people. When? Last week it happened. Up to Tuesday, in 68 boat strikes, at least 227 people the Trump administration labels as narco-terrorists have been killed in almost a year, with no evidence provided against them of drugs found or anything. Nothing has been given. No evidence has been forwarded, which means, therefore, that we are literally slaves. And we can't contest what the United States is doing here in the region. I must remind my readers that there are no international waters in the Caribbean Sea. Every square centimeter falls in the territorial sea or exclusive economic zone of one country or another. In fact, I don't believe there's even one circum-Caribbean country whose waters do not overlap with its neighbors, requiring delimitation treaties. This means that when the U.S. military bombs vessels in the Caribbean Sea, they are more than likely encroaching on the territory of other countries. The U.S. has jurisdiction over some waters in the Caribbean, which is suggesting that they control the region. They're telling us that they control the region. So we have to now wake up and see what the dickens is going on. Now, the Jamaican Observer is reporting here the story that Jamaica, U.S. signed new deal to strengthen military cooperation. So it's always about security. Always. That is the excuse that they're giving right now. Remember, during the Cold War, they told us about communism, that they need to limit the expansion of communism. Now they are using a different pretext, but it's the same agenda, and that understand. Jamaica and the United States have signed a status of forces agreement aimed at strengthening military and security cooperation between the two countries. According to a joint media release issued by the governments on Thursday, the agreement establishes the terms under which members of the United States armed forces may be temporarily present in Jamaica for mutually agreed activities, including training exercises and joint operations. And we saw that in Trinidad and Tobago when they were about to capture the former president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. The same thing happens, the same language, but they know that we're dull and we don't make connections, so they can do the same things over and over, and nobody in this region will ever make the connection. The agreement builds on decades of security cooperation between the Jamaica Defense Force and the United States Armed Forces, including joint training exercises, professional exchanges, humanitarian and disaster response activities, and other forms of security cooperation. Now, that is what they're telling us, but we know that beneath that sort of surface level assessment, that we know that it's about what controlling our sovereignty. Now, I want to show you what is coming out of our analysis in the Caribbean. Let us look at what Nationwide is saying, George is saying, as if this is something that he doesn't know. And you're not going to get any sort of good analysis as we are doing here on this platform. So you can go there to other sources and waste your time. But these people are about just giving you surface sort of analysis, and you're going to see the real truth when the United States occupies all the Caribbean. So let us look at what Nationwide is saying about this. And this is a major news network analysis in Jamaica that people listen to, and they think that they're getting correct and critical news.
Specifics, are we satisfied with what has been communicated in the joint statement? Do we see the utility of the USA having a presence here to help us with the numerous problems? You heard Dr. Chan speaking to me on Wednesday morning say that the amount of drugs that we intercept at our ports of entry is a drop in the bucket compared to what goes through, what passes through, or what stays here to be passed further after a time. We need help with all that because our location makes us a prime spot for drug transshipment. It's a prime spot for the movement of cargo of all kinds, legal and contraband. And of course, we can't do it ourselves. There are many things we can't fix ourselves. We need help. What do you pay for the help? There are no free lunches at international level. Man buy you a breakfast, you better understand that he'll be asking for something later. No country gives anything for free. What will be required of us in exchange for this deep cooperation, and how do our leaders reconcile the benefits that we are set to gain versus what we may have to give up to establish and secure the partnership? Our story on Thursday said we are among about 120 countries who have a similar agreement with the United States. I mean, if anybody can tell me how better to protect our borders, how better to enhance our security capabilities, national security capabilities, how best to play our part in regional security so that our inattention to regional security doesn't cause problems here that we then have to use our resources to fix. If anybody knows a better way than through deeper collaboration with the United States in ways like the one we're talking about now, I'll be happy to hear and learn and to understand. For now, this is the game. This is how we're playing it. And we have to go forward on trust. Look at the history. Look at the history of cooperation between the US and Jamaica governments. There have been things that we haven't been pleased with, but how much of it have we been pleased with? So, from a net gain perspective, has Jamaica net gained from its security collaboration with the US over time? For me, the answer is a resounding yes. And if we go by the principle that there are no free lunches, then we accept that, some things didn't go right, some things could have gone much better. But we are here, and we're better for the collaboration.
I would like to know, if you ask the typical Caribbean person what is a status of force agreement, they won't know, They won't know. They don't care, and they don't know. What they're responding is what they're seeing the media saying, and you're not willing to engage in a critical analysis of what is happening. Now, this is a guy who is on one of the major news networks in Jamaica. And he's asking whether or not this is going to benefit us. Haven't we seen that it did not benefit Trinidad and Tobago? Have we not seen that it did not benefit all of the countries? Okinawa, well, Okinawa is not a country, it's a prefecture in Japan. And that is what he should have been doing, what I am doing here, by letting the citizens understand a status of forces agreement and the binding agreements that we're forced to enter into, including the giving up, the surrender of our national sovereignty. Now, what happens when the United States gets into the region and begins to bomb areas of the country? Because it can do that, right? It did that with the high seas. It bombed boats, killed many people, and today the families of these people have not gotten any form of justice. And you think you're waiting to see what is going to happen when we have seen before what happened? Are we for real? Or are we able to connect the dots and be able to synthesize? And that is one skill that is lacking here in the region. Can't think critically, and we can't make connections. Now, Stephen is saying, so like in the United States, they can murder Black and not be held accountable. Yes, they can murder anyone, by the way, and not be held accountable. Then it looks like Marco Rubio is falling through on his speech he made in Munich. Right. And remember now that the status forces agreement are agreements that have been before even this guy here, Marco Rubio. As we're suggesting here, go and read the book on the trilogies on, that's what's his name again, Chalmers Johnson's trilogy that he wrote on American Empire, right? The Sorrows of the Empire, and also on Blowback. These are books that will tell you how these status of forces agreements operate. And if you understand how they operate in Japan and in other countries, in over 120 countries that with which the United States have these agreements, then you'll understand what is happening. But most of us don't understand, and we're, oh, what's going to happen? And Andrew Holness is getting visas. You only think about visas. And that's what people in Jamaica are thinking, that they get visas because Andrew Holness has entered into an agreement, okay, with the United States. All we think about is economic agreement. And that is why we are going to go right back on the plantation, because we don't understand geopolitics. We're waiting for reparations. We're waiting for visas, which will never come. Now, Okinawa, we have with a genocide. Absolutely. What happened in Okinawa and what continues to happen today is genocide. Absolutely. Now, this is not going to make it safer for the coast, or for the cost of living is still going to go up. Guns and drugs are going to increase because of US presidents. They bring in the guns and the drugs. Absolutely. And they're the ones who are bringing the guns and the drugs in the first place. But they have to give, as I told you in my analysis, they have to render a pretext. They have to give you an excuse for which they are going to take away your civil liberties. The same thing they do in the United States. After 9/11, they used the war on terror to what? To strip United state citizens of their civil liberties. So they are doing the same thing here. That's what we have to understand. So this is not just about Jamaica or Barbados or Trinidad or Guyana or the DR. It's much more than that. Okay? Now, by the way, as we're looking at that, the Dominican Republic, look at what they've done, because this is also important in light of their signing of their status of forces agreement. And they're saying here that the U.S. Dominican Republic expels Cuban diplomats. The Dominican Republic expelled at least 9 Cuban diplomats on April 13, though Cuba claimed the number was 10. The day marked the centennial of Fidel Castro's birth, and the announcement came as a celebratory 3-hour political cultural gala was taking place at the Autonomous University of Santo Domingo. News of the action spread while attendance at the event swelled to over 2,000 people. And they're saying journalist Pablo McKinney wrote after the expulsions that I've never felt so much like we were a pawn. This is a Dominican writing. This is a Dominican writing. I have never felt so much like we were a pawn of another country. Leaders of small left-leaning Dominican political formations criticized their governments, among them Mino Tavares Mirabal, founder of the Democratic Option, Guillermo Moreno, and he's the president of the Alliance for the Country, and Maria Teresa Cabrera, she's the president of the Broad Front. The diplomats arrived in Havana 5 days later, and Cuban Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Josefina Vidal, commented that Dominican officials were unable to offer one reason justifying their decision. They didn't have a reason. They did not have one reason, because there are none. There's no reason but that the United States asked them to do it, and they had to do it because they have binding agreements within the Status of Forces Agreement. But serving their U.S. overseers would have been the reason enough, and the timing of the action with Castro's birthday would have pleased them. Kicking out the Cuban diplomats was the latest in a string of actions taken by the Dominican government that seem aimed at curry favor with the Trump administration, right? So they're currying favor with the U.S. administration. At the UN General Assembly in October 2025, the Dominican Republic abstained rather than votes its customary approval of an annual resolution calling for the U.S. blockade of Cuba to end. In November 2025, and again 6 months later, Dominican authorities opened up 2 of the country's airports to the comings and goings of U.S. military aircraft. Prompted by the U.S. Dominican President Luis Abinader, canceled the 10th Summit of the Americas, which he was to have hosted in Punta Cana in late 2025. He had previously disinvited Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. The Dominican Republic also joined with the right-wing governments of Panama, Costa Rica, and Ecuador to form the so-called Alliance for Democratic Development, ADD. The group fosters commercial and political cooperation under U.S. tutelage. The Abinader government cooperated with those same nations in sending electoral observers to Honduras's most recent presidential elections and the venue for U.S. interference. Under U.S. auspices, the compliant Dominican government joined 10 other right-wing regional governments in March 2026 in Florida to form the so-called Shield of the Americas. The meeting centered on building support for U.S. military intervention against narco-terrorism. So the narrative is the same. It's repetitive. This is something that is not new. If Barbados is going to have to sign it, Trinidad Tobago has already signed it, Guyana too, Jamaica has now signed it. All countries in the Caribbean and perhaps in the entire region will have to sign it. U.S. sway over the Dominican Republic has long been in the making. They're saying here, the U.S. government proposed to annex the nation during the Ulysses Grant administration and carried out a military occupation from 1916 until 1924. Only at the end of the brutal Rafael Trujillo, that is from 1930 to 1961, did the U.S. back off from supporting it. The United States supported dictatorship in here, right there in the Dominican Republic. President Juan Bush took office in 1963, 4 years after the victory of Cuba's revolution. He introduced progressive reforms and was opposed to the Dominican Republic becoming a base of operations for the CIA against the Cuban Revolution. The result was a military coup that removed him 7 months later. Can you imagine that the people of the DR, they democratically elected their president, and the United States booted him out of office 7 months after he was elected. A group of young officers in April 1965 deposed the coup government, seeking Bush's return to power. The U.S. government, apprehensive about another Caribbean revolution, carried out a military invasion. U.S. troops by the tens of thousands occupied the country for 11 months, and 4,000 Dominicans died. Right? 4,000 Dominicans died. This was a watershed moment. The occupation and subsequent presidency of Joaquin Balaguer, and he was president from 1966 to 1978, introduced aggressive modes of control. Balaguer presided over oppression of social movements and tolerated paramilitary violence in the country. What we're seeing happening in the Caribbean, particularly in Jamaica now, we can see where they are now rounding up the police forces to actually deal with citizens who are not going to go with the program. They are already doing that. And if they can take you off your land, they will do it. The center-left governments arriving after the Balaguer era of oppression included a repeat and tamed Balaguer presidents in 1986 to 1996. They managed a few democratic openings while emphasizing neoliberal reforms. Large-scale migration of Dominicans to the United States acted as a safety valve, alleviating pressure for change during these years. Now, if we want to understand the effectiveness of the neoliberal sort of economic theory, we must look at the DR. Because when you come to the DR, you'll see lots of what you think is economic development, but for them, for many people, they are not a part of that economic development. The US and the Dominican Republic are as one in carrying out racial oppression and beating up of Haitians. Cooperation shows in the legal arms of the coup plotters entering Haiti from the US. The Dominican government, meanwhile, is building an anti-migrant wall along its Haitian border. The same thing that the US is doing with the border between Mexico and the United States. Anti-Black hatred has long prevailed in the Dominican Republic. Haitians and their families have lived there for generations. They are mostly undocumented and regularly suffer abuse. As a low-paid labor force, they're essential for Dominican agriculture. Even so, by the end of 2025, the Abinader government had forcibly deported over 200,000 Haitians at a rate of 10,000 deportations per week. A 2013 court ruling depriving Haitians of birthright citizenship opened the door to or for the deportation. So we can see where the Dominican Republic is actually cooperating with the United States government. And many times these agreements are there in the SOFAs. So we have to be concerned. If we understand what is happening in the DR in Haiti, we must be concerned. The problem is many of us don't understand, and neither do we want to understand. Let me just have you listen to one more clip before we get into what you're saying and to discuss this thing more profoundly. Now, let's get there. We have third country and the status of forces agreement. Look at what Andrew Hollis is doing in Jamaica. And that is why we're having these third country nationals going to our countries, because they have to do it. Okay? I didn't get it on. It hasn't come on the screen. Oh, okay, let me go back to it. Get it. Okay.
I want to say that Jamaica is being forced to take the third country deportees. But I want to tell you that Jamaica is not being forced to do anything. Jamaica is begging for the third country nationals.
Additionally, I want to thank Jamaica for working with the Department of War to
Right. So that is what we are seeing, where they are using, these, policies of the United States to frighten Caribbean governments so that they will eventually have the United States come in the region and strip us of every right that we have as citizens here. So you can still there go and think that going around and talking about your political parties and what they're doing and not looking at what is happening, what these agreements that they're signing you onto without your knowing, without your consent, but you are there jumping up and making some noise, thinking that you are going to get your governments out and everything is going to be all right. Okay, so you can behave like children who do not have any brain. A quiet military takeover and these idiot clowns at Randy's Caribbean countries are allowed it so they can have their visas. Correct. They are the ones who are going to be getting their visas and the perks that come with these sort of agreements, not you. So you can sit there and wait for visas until thy kingdom come. It is not going to happen. For the leaders, yes, and the economic elites, that will happen. They will curry favor and they'll get some perks, but not the population itself. My question is, Maria is asking, is how is this solving the drug problem in America? They don't want to solve the drug problem. By the way, let me just say that to you. They do not want to solve the drug problem. How do you know? How do you think the pharmaceutical companies and the United States get its wealth from? I have been saying for years, and I used to tell my university students that the whole matter of slavery, when we had the trafficking of slaves, after slavery ended, in our days, contraband and the gun trafficking, all of that is a new slavery, human trafficking, right? That is the new form of slavery. They don't want to, did they want to stop slavery? No, they didn't want to stop slavery because slavery was profitable, right? So the same thing for drugs, it's profitable. And many of you see there in the United States some wealth and you think they just got it through legal means. No, it didn't happen like that. The same thing with the gun trafficking. Do you know also that embedded in some of these status of agreements, the SOFAs, are the whole matter of drug trafficking and arms trafficking too? Yeah. So your governments have to budget for arms trafficking every budget that they make, but they are not going to tell you that, right? So Andrew Holness knows how many guns get into Jamaica because he has formed agreements secretively with the United States that we're not aware of. And then they tell us that, oh, it's a problem, it has to be solved. They create the problem and then they create the solutions. And the solutions are always to strip us rather of our national sovereignty and also freedoms. This is the underlying plan and agenda. They always do it. And we have never woken up because we don't want to wake up. We want to behave as fools in the region, and then hopefully we're thinking that only if Andrew Holness leaves tomorrow, only if Miss Miyamoto leaves tomorrow, things are going to be rosy and well in Jamaica and Barbados. And it is not going to be rosy. In fact, it's going to be worse because each successive presidents that come and prime ministers, the United States pressures them to do even more. All right, so you're not going to solve this problem without your understanding the profundity of the problem and not just reacting to problems and saying, oh, we have to get Black people empowered. That is not going to happen, right? Because we are predominantly Black here and we are not empowered and we don't want to be empowered, do we? Okay, we only are listening to gossips and foolish nonsense and we're not waking up to what is happening. Ask us about the SOFAs. We don't know, and we don't want to know. So yeah, this is something that is crucial to our understanding of what is happening in the region at the moment. And one day we might just wake up to see that all our rights have been shelved. The United States is bombing land, right, air and sea, and we cannot do anything, will not be able to do anything because the status of forces agreements have already been signed, and it is not about security. It's not about security. It has everything to do about full control and the full erosion of your sovereignty, right? Of your freedom. So keep on sleeping. Keep sleeping because a great surprise awaits you. So yeah, any questions before we go? Any other question? Oh, you have some other, I have some other questions here, comments. Yeah, we can contest because we have signed over our sovereignty. We might as well just stop celebrating independence because none of these countries are independent. We are not. And we don't even know, as we're saying, what are the entire agreements mentioned in the SOFAs. What we do know, as I'm suggesting, is that based on what we've seen in other countries, such as Okinawa, well, it's a prefecture in Japan, among other countries, the Trinidad and Tobago, we understand that it is not pretty. It's nothing that they are going to, it's not going to benefit us. It's not to benefit us. It's to benefit the United States and its imperial quest to control the world. That is what it's about. And then we have now with the Russian or Chinese do this. Well, I have been saying that they are working. At the end of the day, we are not, the Russians and the Chinese don't want to free anybody, right? And that's what we have to understand. If we want to free, we have to free ourselves, right? The Russians, and they're going to do things that are in their interests. That is what powers do, right? And if we were in power, we would do the same. It's human nature, right? To go after that which benefits them in their interests and not the interests of the wider populace. Okay, and that's what we have to understand. So the Chinese or the Russians, yes, the Chinese doing the same thing. They're buying up our lands too, every day. We have spoken about the Chinese before. Why are we still holding on to this, illusion that the Chinese are here to help us? They are not. This will not solve the drug problem in America, in my opinion. It will only increase, absolutely, because the drug trafficking is very important to sustain the U.S. military-industrial complex, and also gun trafficking, very important, things, resources that the U.S. uses to prop up its drug trafficking and its economy. Is this the man serious? He sounds like a defeated slave. No, well, that's how all our journalists sound, really, that's how they sound. But this is costing our fisher folks their lives. They don't care, right? Do you think the United States even cares about the soldiers, U.S. soldiers that are being killed in the wars that they're being sent to fight? No. So why would they care about our fisher folks and the civilians in the region? In fact, that is a part of the whole population control agenda, right? They are using one stone to kill many birds, right? So when we see them coming here and they're killing people, it means nothing to them. It means nothing to them. To us, yes, because we're normal. But notice that the lady there on Kaboo, on RFM of Jamaica, she said that it's a transhuman agenda. Transhuman. They're no longer treating us as humans. They're treating us as objects that can be gotten rid of just like that. Right? So you kill a fly, the way how you kill a fly, it means nothing to you. You kill a mosquito, it means absolutely nothing to you. That is how the United States is actually behaving at the moment. The economy is fueled by drug money. Absolutely. Absolutely. And everybody knows that. Wall Street, if you read the book, even by Whitney Webb, when the One Nation Under Blackmail, she makes that very clear if our people don't understand. All right. But the problem is that we don't want to learn about these things. We think that, arguing over nonsense is what is really political commentary. So I think that we just have to suffer whatever thing comes our way. Their solution is taken away. Right. That's the solution. And they want to take away our freedom. And if we are willing to give it up, I would do so too. Right? If we are willing to give up our freedom, I think they should do it. Right? Because that's the only way we will learn. That is the only way that we will learn. When we lose our freedom, but it's going to be too late. You can't fight anymore because your freedom would have been lost because you weren't paying attention. And you read history, every pages in which people have been enslaved, they all said the same thing. We were not paying attention. We were not paying attention to what our leaders were doing, and hence the way we signed off to our slavery, or on our slavery, right? So that is what is happening here in the Caribbean, and we are not paying attention. Notice we have control, water control. We have, what else we were talking about? The books that we read are about to be controlled, right? So many land control. We are being attacked on every side. Our health is being controlled. Everything is being controlled. And our people are still on podcasts, wasting time talking who is going to be the better leader to lead the country, when we can see whether it's PNM or it is UNC or DLP or BLP, they are the same. And the same agenda. Barbados just came out of an election, and I thought the Barbadians would have woken up. They have not woken up. They're still talking about Mr. Mia Motley. Right? Not understanding that the system, whether the DLP had come into power, he would do the same. Because it is an agenda. and they work together. They want to win, yes, but at the end of the day, they work together because their agenda is the same. All right? It's just that the person who leads gets more money, right? And it has access to more perks. So he or she wants to win, but they're not winning for you. They're winning so that they can get their perks and that they can be famous and they can do whatever they want to do. So stop with this nonsense of the domestic politics. The domestic politics right now, you can ignore what is happening in your domestic politics. About what's happening in Jamaica, what is happening, because, or if you are following what is happening there, make sure you link them to what is happening in the geopolitics in the United States, in Washington, D.C. If you are just limiting to what happens in Parliament, in the Barbados Parliament or Jamaica Parliament, or there in Guyana, you are not going to understand politics, and you don't understand it. Right? But you're still there. Wow, Miss Mia Motley, she has to go. Let's make some noise. Make some noise. She knows that you can make all the noise you want to make. Right? The agenda remains the same. Okay? So when are we going to wake up and see that the geopolitics here is what is controlling the region? And the ignorance here is enormous that sometimes I really wonder if we have any brain. I do wonder. Don't we see it? And one of the things that hurts me is that they're telling you what they're doing. They're literally now telling. Trump is literally saying, I am doing this. You're still sleeping. You're still sleeping. You don't want to wake up. And he's telling you. Once you would have to go to read, some books, some very whatever books, to see what is happening. Right now, they're telling you with their mouths that we're doing this. We want to control the population. We want to kill people. And you're still sleeping, right? And the other day, we saw what happened in the Caribbean. We saw what happened with the boats being struck. And nothing, silence. We reacted to it. And the only reason we reacted was because they were about to take Nicolas Maduro. After Nicolas Maduro was captured, nothing. We don't care what happened after Nicolas Maduro left. We don't care. It's only we learned nothing from Nicolas Maduro. Nothing. The same thing with Jason Arde. Nothing. It's just, and we blame him and we talk all we want to talk against Jason Arde, and we are doing the same thing in the Caribbean. Right? I don't know when we're going to wake up. I really don't know. But you know. Yeah, it's what it is. It's truth. I have to speak it because it's really, when we look at what is happening, it is sad. I thought we had more sense here in the region. And no, we are controlled by the domestic politics. The domestic politics is killing us, is clouding our minds. Another thing I want to get out of is this whole matter of this Pan-Africanist ideology. And just everything is black and white. Everything is not black and white. Everything is not East versus West. It's much more complicated than it would be nice, because it's easy to, if I had to just look at black and white issues, and the East versus the West, my commentaries would have been made so easier, right? But it is not that. It's much more, it's deeper. It's much more nuanced. It's much more layered than just a black-white issue. And we're getting that coming from the US media, that everything is white and black, right? But we have to look at systems of power, and that they are consolidating power globally. They are consolidating. The United States has SOFA with over 120 countries. It's not only with Jamaica. It's not only with Trinidad and Tobago. It's not only with Guyana. It is with 120 countries. And we're playing here in the region. Oh, I want my visa as long as the US can give us visa to go to the United States. As long as the United States give us something for the IMF, or the IMF, some sort of help, assistance with the IMF or whatever, right? We are happy. We are happy as a lot. But we don't want to understand the fine tune of this SOFA agreement, the security until we're killed, or family members are unalived, and then we begin to cry. We fill up the live and cry, talking nonsense. Right? But we have to look at what is happening now, ladies and gentlemen. We've got to look at things more critically and be more proactive and not reactive. Okay? And that is my little talk for this afternoon. Is there any other question, comment before we end the live? Make sure you like the live and share the live with as many people on the platform, because we need to hear this. And the algorithm is laughing at us because, wow, the algorithm is having a fun time, because it's better to keep the people in ignorance. And the people desire it too, so why not? I don't blame the algorithm. I blame the people. Right, so let's go now. Any more questions? Any more questions? Comments? Thank you so much for joining. I hope that you'll have a great evening, and make sure you like the live before you leave, and we'll talk in another one. Ciao.